Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us straight out of the judge vault, and this is a bit of an emotional ruling for me because I'm one of the judges who put it there. My original video on this interaction garnered nearly 50,000 views, which is a lot for my channel even now, and it was a whole lot for me 4 years ago, almost to the day when that video was originally published. I've been wanting to streamline my explanation and update this DDR to my current production standards for a while now, and the rules changes from the new Final Fantasy set are just the occasion. So, what happens if there's an Urza Saga and a Blood Moon out at the same time? Okay, first off, Blood Moon will affect Urza Saga, because Urza Saga is a land, and it does not have the supertype Basic. This means Urza Saga is a non-basic land. That being said, let's consider what the rest of Urza Saga type line will look like. Blood Moon sets the subtype of all non-basic lands to Mountain. Because Blood Moon does not specify that the lands get to keep their original subtypes, for example with wording like in addition to their other types or similar, that means Mountain completely overwrites any other land subtypes that the Urza Saga had. Now, there's no general way to know this other than looking at the relevant sections of the CR, but I can tell you that Urza's is a land subtype and Saga is an enchantment subtype. This is important because Blood Moon only wants to change land subtypes. Card types are unaffected, and the same is true for any subtypes corresponding to any card type besides land. Urza Saga doesn't have any supertypes like Snow or Legendary, but if it did, those would likewise be unaffected. This means the final type line for the Urza Saga will look like this. It will be an Enchantment Land Mountain Saga. If you're familiar with how Blood Moon interacts with Dryad Arbor, then that should look pretty familiar, because that ruling uses exactly the same principles. Now, let's consider what abilities the Urza Saga will have. You might have noticed in the mockup that I had on screen earlier that I switched from the Saga card layout to the normal one. And that's because it doesn't really make sense to use the Saga layout given that Urza Saga won't have any chapter abilities anymore. If you've played with Blood Moon before, you already know that one of the things it does is it gets rid of all the non-basic land's abilities. This is because of this rule here, which says that setting a land's subtype to Mountain gets rid of all the abilities that land has, and it gives it the ability to tap for red mana. Now that includes the Urza Saga chapter abilities, even though most people would probably say that those are more strongly associated with being a saga than being a land, the game makes no such distinction. Blood Moon removes all abilities that are printed on the card, whether they have anything to do with being a land or not. Because it's a game rule removing these abilities and not a continuous effect, it happens at the same time the Blood Moon changes the land's subtypes, which is in Layer 4. This fact is going to be important for when we consider what other abilities Urza Saga might have. And I imagine that last sentence caused a couple of eyebrows to go up. Other abilities? Why would Urza Saga have any other abilities if Blood Moon is taking all its abilities away? Well, if you've been a fan of the channel for a while now, you might remember my video about Blood Moon and Bootlegger's Stash, where the Bootlegger's Stash gave its ability to non-basic lands after Blood Moon took all the abilities away. This is true no matter what order those enchantments entered the battlefield because of what we were talking about earlier, where the Blood Moon's ability removing actually happens in Layer 4, which is before Layer 6, the layer where ability adding and removing usually happens. Now, even if we don't have a Bootlegger's Stash in play, there's still a pretty good chance that there will be a continuous effect acting on the Urza Saga that wants to give it an ability. To see why, let's observe how the Chapter 1 ability of this card is worded. Urza Saga gains tap add colorless. This is a continuous effect that wants to give an ability to Urza Saga. Now guess what? This works exactly the same as what we saw with Bootlegger's Stash. Regardless of timestamps, if the Urza Saga Chapter 1 ability has resolved, that Urza Saga will gain the ability to tap for 1 colorless mana. And that ability gets added after Blood Moon takes away Urza Saga's other abilities, meaning that even with Blood Moon out, Urza Saga can still tap for colorless. The same thing is true for the ability that lets you make construct tokens. Urza Saga will have that ability if the Chapter 2 ability is resolved, and the Blood Moon won't change that. Now, I can already hear some people wondering about something. If Blood Moon takes away all of Urza Saga's abilities in Layer 4, well, how can there be any continuous effect acting on Urza Saga in Layer 6? Now, this would be a big problem if the Chapter 1 ability was worded something like, as long as there are one or more lore counters on this permanent, it has tap add colorless. Now in this case, the continuous effect giving Urza Saga the ability would result from a static ability that the Urza Saga had, which the Blood Moon could take away. But have a look at how the Chapter 1 ability is actually worded. Officially, this ability is a triggered ability that triggers when the first lore counter is placed on Urza Saga, and this triggered ability sets up a continuous effect in the game as it resolves. Blood Moon is not able to change the fact that this triggered ability has resolved, and that's why Urza's Saga can still have the activated abilities it gets at Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, even if Blood Moon is making it lose all of its abilities. And so with that, this is what the Urza Saga will finally look like. It's a colorless Enchantment Land - Mountain Saga with tap add red, tap add colorless, and 2-tap create a construct. Now, if you watched my old video, you might remember all of this is exactly how it worked before. But you probably also remember me being really sad because none of these cool interactions were relevant unless they were going to print some kind of neutron hate card that cared about whether a land had the Urza subtype or not. Well, it looks like Wizards of the Coast has finally heard my complaint, because now, understanding what Urza Saga looks like has actually become very relevant. Over the last 4 years, I think everyone has probably become familiar with the idea that Blood Moon kills Urza Saga. Now, that happened because if you have a saga that has too many lore counters on it, you have to sacrifice it. Too many being defined by the highest chapter ability that saga had. So it used to be the case that if your saga somehow lost all of its chapter abilities, any number of lore counters on it would be too many. Now, the rule that makes you sacrifice sagas has been rewritten so it does not apply to sagas with no chapter abilities. Therefore, if you have a Blood Moon out removing all abilities from an Urza Saga, the Urza Saga will remain on the battlefield, just like any other non-basic land. Remember, tap add colorless is not a chapter ability. The Urza Saga Chapter 1 ability is when you put your first lore counter on Urza Saga, it gains tap add colorless. So yeah, officially the Urza Saga would not have any chapter abilities, even though it does have some abilities it gained from its chapter abilities resolving. And so with that set, let's cover a couple of other interactions that have now become relevant. First up, you know how you put a lore counter on all your sagas at the beginning of your main phase? Well, that rule has also been rewritten, so it only applies to sagas that have chapter abilities. Therefore, if there's a Blood Moon out, it will freeze all your Urza Sagas at whatever number of lore counters they had when the Blood Moon entered the battlefield. They won't get any new lore counters unless you proliferate one on there or something like that, which would be a really mean thing to do because the Urza Saga wouldn't have any chapter abilities that would normally trigger when that happens. Now here's an interesting point. The thing that gives the first lore counter to sagas as they enter is actually a game rule and not an ability. This means that if you play an Urza Saga while there is a Blood Moon out, it still gets its first lore counter. This is extra confusing because that's the opposite of how Planeswalkers and battles work. But okay. Now, remember what we said earlier. The Chapter 1 ability officially triggers when you put the first lore counter on Urza Saga, except if there's a Blood Moon out, that ability won't exist. Therefore, if you play an Urza Saga while there is a Blood Moon out, that Urza Saga won't be able to tap for colorless even if you kill the Blood Moon later on. Not unless you jump through some pretty serious hoops. All of this stuff is true for the new Saga creatures, by the way. If you play one while there's a Dress Down out, it won't die, and it will still get its first lore counter, but you won't get the Chapter 1 ability. They don't get new lore counters if they're enchanted with a Lignify, and so on. Now, let's close out with one last fun challenge question to test your understanding. Let's say you have an Urza Saga and you move it to Chapter 3 during your main phase. In response, someone flashes in a Blood Moon effect. What happens? And yes, setting this up in the first place does require a little bit of hoop jumping because Blood Moon does not have Flash, but you could definitely play it like it has Flash via a Vidalcan Orrery, or maybe Violin, a Harbinger of the Seas, or whatever you want to do that. Okay, so to properly answer this question, we're going to need to get a little bit more formal about when specifically the Blood Moon is entering. Recall that the first thing that happens in the main phase is the turn-based action of putting a lore counter on all your sagas. Doing that will cause the Chapter 3 ability of Urza Saga to trigger. The earliest chance that you would have to cast a spell in this sequence would be to respond to that triggered ability after it's put on the stack. If you wanted to cast the Blood Moon before then, you would have to do it during the draw step, which would have the same result as if you just played a normal sorcery speed Blood Moon with the Urza Saga at 2. So let's go through step by step to see exactly what would happen if you responded to the Chapter 3 ability. We'll start off with the very beginning when you're transitioning into the main phase. The first thing that happens is the turn-based action of putting a lore counter on all your sagas. After this, before any player gets priority, triggered abilities that have triggered are put onto the stack. Now this would include any chapter abilities, as well as any other abilities that trigger at the beginning of your main phase, like, for example, Blinkmithern. If there are multiple triggered abilities that need to go on the stack, the normal app-nap ordering is used for all of them. If you need a refresher on how that process works, check out my video on Flicker and Thought Not Seer. If you watched that video, you might have noticed a bit of a red flag. State-based actions, such as the thing that makes you sacrifice sagas, are checked after turn-based actions are completed, but before any triggered abilities go onto the stack. However, as you can see, this state-based action is carefully worded such that it does not occur until after the last chapter ability has resolved, or otherwise left the stack. So, after Blood Moon resolves, Urza Saga will still be in play, and even though it has no chapter abilities, its chapter 3 ability has already triggered, and once that happens, it exists independently from its source, meaning that the chapter 3 ability will go on to resolve the same as it normally would. After you finish with that is the time when you would normally officially have to sacrifice the Urza Saga. But because Blood Moon is removing all its chapter abilities, the Urza Saga is still exempt from this state-based action. And so the Urza Saga will remain on the battlefield with all its lore counters still on it and looking like this. It will not get any new lore counters as long as Blood Moon stays in play, and as soon as the Blood Moon leaves play, the game will check to see how many lore counters the Urza Saga has, and sacrifice it if appropriate. If at this time the Urza Saga has few enough lore counters on it that it can remain on the battlefield, it'll go back to getting a new one at the start of your main phase, just like it normally would. Whew, that was a lot of material to cover. Give yourself a big pat on the back if you made it all the way here, and if you have any other questions about this interaction, be sure to put them in the comments, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.